15%. Lyle Vance's sudden laughter echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass paneling of his executive suite, reverberating around the room like shards of broken crystal. He leaned back in his leather swivel chair, wiping a tiny tear of amusement from the corner of his eye, his tailored suit jacket straining against his broad shoulders. "You stand in my office requesting a 15% compensation adjustment after 16 years? That is the most comical proposal I have heard all fiscal quarter." Lyle could barely finish his sentence before another rolling chuckle shook his chest. I stood completely motionless in front of his polished mahogany desk, my hands firmly gripping an 85-page technical audit binder. Contained within those pages was the empirical documentation of 16 years of my career, every predictive distribution model, every cross-docking optimization script, and every midnight architectural overhaul I had executed, while Lyle collected performance bonuses large enough to acquire waterfront estates. My proprietary algorithms had streamlined our regional distribution matrix, reducing transit delays by 55% and preserving our flagship account with Vanguard Global Enterprises. "The Vanguard contract alone generates millions in recurring revenue," I said, maintaining a controlled, measured tone despite the tightening knot in my throat. "I redesigned our predictive routing framework from the ground up, working 70-hour workweeks for 6 consecutive months without overtime compensation. Meanwhile, my base salary has drifted 35% below prevailing industry benchmarks for senior supply chain architects." Lyle waved a manicured hand dismissively through the air, his condescending smile hardening into the practiced mask of a corporate executive. "Everyone is ultimately replaceable in this organization, Julian," he declared calmly, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Even a seasoned architect like you. The board does not review back-office line items, nor do they track individual engineering staff. If you truly believe your technical contributions command higher compensation on the open market, by all means, feel free to test your luck elsewhere." Something fundamental fractured inside me at that precise moment. It was not anger or hurt pride, but rather a cold, crystalline clarity settling over my 54-year-old mind. The illusion of 16 years of professional loyalty melted away. I gathered my technical binder from the mahogany desk, the heavy paper crisp under my calloused fingers. "I understand your position clearly, Lyle," I replied quietly, keeping my composure intact. "Listen to me, Julian," Lyle added, his tone adopting a patronizing warmth that felt utterly hollow. "You are exceptional at execution, but you belong to an operational cost center. Support functions do not drive enterprise valuation. That is simply how corporate business operates. My name is Julian Ross. I am 54 years old, a senior supply chain architect specializing in algorithmic freight optimization. Up until that Tuesday afternoon, I had lived my entire life with an entrenched dread of workplace confrontation. I was the kind of Midwestern professional raised by a blue-collar factory worker who believed that quiet diligence, uncomplaining endurance, and loyalty to one's employer would eventually be rewarded. My father had devoted 38 years to a steel stamping mill in Ohio before the corporate parent liquidated the facility with 60 days of notice under the Warren Act, Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101. He died believing that hard work was its own justification. Sitting in Lyle's office, I realized I had inherited his quiet compliance, but I would not inherit his tragic ending. I walked back down the quiet corridor to my corner cubicle on the 5th floor, past the glass-walled offices of junior regional directors who had been with Pinnacle Freight Systems for less than 3 years. My desk sat tucked beside a bank of silent server racks. Over the past 6 years, our engineering department had been methodically downsized from 18 full-time software engineers to just 4. The downsizing was not caused by shrinking operational demands, but because the automated routing systems I built had eliminated 70% of manual dispatch workflows. My monitor blinked with a new notification. The monthly corporate newsletter featuring a polished photo of Lyle, standing alongside Vanguard's logistics director. The headline praised Lyle's visionary supply chain overhaul that had saved Vanguard millions in annual freight overhead. My architecture, my mathematical models, My personal sacrifices were reduced to a vague footnote about enterprise operational synergy. Beside my keyboard sat a framed photograph of my late parents taken outside our modest brick home in Cleveland. Loyalty matters above all else. Son, my father used to say over Sunday morning coffee. Standing there in the quiet cubicle, looking at his weather-beaten face, I realized that corporate loyalty was a one-way street engineered by executives who viewed human beings as line-item expenses. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a worn black leather notebook with reinforced brass corners. Inside were handwritten mathematical proofs, pseudocode architecture, and data structures I had developed over several years. These were not corporate assignments assigned by Pinnacle managers. They were personal research initiatives documented meticulously with precise timestamps, Git commit hashes, and development logs executed exclusively on my personal Alienware laptop during late evenings and weekend hours. 5 years ago, when Pinnacle was struggling with catastrophic routing bottlenecks across its Midwestern hubs, I had introduced a novel predictive load balancing algorithm. Pinnacle had integrated the software across all 42 freight terminals nationwide. However, what Lyle Vance and Pinnacle's legal team had never audited was my original employment contract signed 16 years prior. The agreement contained standard boilerplate language covering intellectual property developed during official working hours using company assets. Crucially, Pinnacle had never required senior engineering staff to execute a formal assignment of prior inventions or off-hours personal projects. Under federal copyright law, specifically Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, the exclusive rights to reproduce, derivative work creation, and commercial distribution of independently created technical works remain vested in the author absent an explicit written transfer of copyright ownership. My personal notebook contained absolute proof that the core engine driving Pinnacle's distribution matrix was my personal intellectual property. I picked up my mobile phone and scrolled to a contact I had saved 9 months prior but had never dialed. Grant Mercer, the Vice President of Global Operations at Nexus Logistics Corporation, Pinnacle's direct regional competitor. Grant had approached me at an intermodal freight conference in Chicago, slipping his card into my palm with a firm handshake. The offer to head our logistic architecture division remains open whenever you decide you have outgrown Pinnacle, Grant had told me then. We do not bury our lead architects in back-office cubicles. My thumb hovered over the call button. 16 years of institutional memory screamed at me to pause, to exercise caution, to negotiate a compromise. Then the sound of Lyle Vance's condescending laughter echoed in my memory. I pressed call. Grant Mercer here, a sharp, crisp voice answered on the second ring. This is Julian Ross from Pinnacle Freight Systems, I said, surprised by the steady resonance in my voice. I believe it is time for us to have that dinner in Chicago. Julian, Grant responded, genuine enthusiasm breaking through his professional tone. I was beginning to worry you would spend your entire career letting Lyle Vance take credit for your mathematical genius. Can you make it to downtown Chicago tonight at 7? 5 hours later, I sat across from Grant Mercer at a quiet corner table inside an upscale steakhouse overlooking the Chicago River. Grant sat back studying me over a glass of sparkling water, a sleek tablet resting on the linen tablecloth between us. I have tracked Pinnacle's operational metrics for the past 7 years, Julian. Grant began tapping the screen. Their unexpected leaps in freight efficiency coincided precisely with periods of intense technical activity, registered under your internal system commits. Those predictive algorithms powering the Vanguard Global account were revolutionary. Our engineering team attempted to reverse engineer your load balancing scripts for 18 months and failed completely. That was when I realized Pinnacle did not possess superior technology. They possessed Julian Ross. How did you know Lyle Vance had no hand in the design, I asked. Cutting into my steak, Grant let out a dry laugh. Because Lyle Vance cannot read basic pseudocode, let alone conceptualize a multivariable stochastic optimization matrix. He is a marketer who inherited a stable freight footprint. What exactly are you looking for to make the leap to Nexus? I laid out my terms plainly. A senior executive position heading your supply chain architecture division, a base compensation package reflecting market realities, specifically 3.5 times my current Pinnacle salary. Equity options, a dedicated team of 6 senior software engineers, and formal recognition of my technical innovations. Furthermore, I intend to bring my proprietary algorithms with me, systems I developed independently on my own time and equipment. Grant's eyes widened slightly as he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You own the underlying copyright to the core distribution engine. I pulled my black leather notebook from my briefcase, alongside an encrypted thumb drive containing dated commit signatures. I presented the documentation showing that the predictive routing architecture was conceived, tested, and authored outside working hours on personal hardware. Pinnacle implemented the system 5 years ago, but their legal department never executed an intellectual property acquisition agreement, nor did they provide consideration for the transfer of rights. Under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, the copyright remains entirely mine. Grant examined the paper trails, his expression shifting from curiosity to profound professional awe. This is an extraordinary legal oversight by Pinnacle's corporate counsel, Julian. Lyle Vance assumed that because you worked in his building, he owned every thought in your head. Lyle told me this afternoon that support functions do not drive enterprise valuation. I replied evenly. He insisted everyone is replaceable. Grant closed the notebook with a soft thud and looked me dead in the eye. Lyle Vance is about to learn the most expensive lesson in corporate supply chain history. 2 weeks after my dinner with Grant Mercer, I walked into Lyle Vance's corner office and placed a formal 3-week resignation notice on his polished mahogany desk. Lyle glanced down at the paper, his eyebrow tweaking upward with mild annoyance as he scanned the heading. 3 weeks of notice? He tossed the document onto his blotter. Where are you heading, Julian? Local consulting firm? Retirement. I am joining Nexus Logistics Corporation as Vice President of Supply Chain Architecture, I said directly. Lyle's posture stiffened instantly. His swivel chair creaked as he sat up straight, his gaze locking onto mine with sudden intensity. Nexus? Our direct competitor? That is an extraordinarily foolish career decision, Julian. We are currently finalizing a 7-year contract extension with Vanguard Global Enterprises valued in the tens of millions. Your departure at this junction displays a severe lack of professional ethics. I designed the operational logistics model. For that Vanguard proposal, I answered calmly. I know every vulnerability in Pinnacle's current network. Lyle's face flushed a deep crimson, but he quickly reassembled his arrogant demeanor, letting out a short, forced laugh. Nexus is overpaying for an aging architect. You will quickly discover that without Pinnacle's infrastructure behind you, your algorithms are useless lines of text. If this is a transparent ploy for that 15% raise, I might be willing to approve a 5% adjustment if you sign a fresh 5-year covenant. My compensation at Nexus is 3.5 times my current salary, accompanied by executive stock options and a dedicated engineering unit, I replied. The time for negotiation expired 2 weeks ago. Lyle leaned back, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. We will see how comfortable you feel when our legal department enforces your non-compete clause. My final 3 weeks at Pinnacle were surreal. I completed my transition documentation with meticulous precision, training my replacement, a terrified 24-year-old recent graduate named Nolan, who looked utterly overwhelmed by the complex codebases he was inheriting. I watched Nolan struggle to understand basic data structures, realizing that Lyle had replaced 16 years of deep institutional knowledge with a novice whose primary qualification was low salary expectations. On my final Friday at 5 o'clock, I was summoned to the corporate conference room for an exit interview with Elliot Reed, Pinnacle's chief legal counsel. Elliot was a sharp 50-year-old attorney known for aggressive litigation tactics. He slid a stack of legal documents across the glass table toward me. Standard exit paperwork, Julian, Elliot said smoothly, tapping a silver pen against the table. Non-disclosure confirmation, return of company hardware, and a formal reaffirmation of your non-compete agreement prohibiting employment with competitor entities within a 200-mile radius for 24 months. I picked up the non-compete agreement, skimmed the text, and laid it back down on the glass. I am not signing this document. Elliot's polished smile faltered. Excuse me? Signing exit covenants is mandatory corporate protocol. It was not part of my original employment contract 16 years ago, I stated firmly. Requiring an employee to execute new restrictive covenants upon departure without providing fresh, independent consideration renders the agreement void ab initio under established contract law principles. Furthermore, I am taking no Pinnacle property. However, I am retaining my personal intellectual property, specifically the predictive distribution algorithms authored on my personal time. Elliot frowned, his forehead furrowing into deep creases. What personal property? Everything created during your tenure belongs to Pinnacle Freight Systems under the work-for-hire doctrine. Work-for-hire requires either creation within the explicit scope of employment duties or a written instrument signed by both parties. Designating the output as a work made for hire, I replied. Referencing Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. I authored the core predictive engine on my personal Alienware laptop during off hours 5 years ago. I submitted written acquisition proposals to Lyle Vance 3 years ago, requesting formal licensing terms. Lyle dismissed the need for formal contracts and implemented the code without acquiring ownership. Here are copies of those logged communications. I slid a folder of printed email threads across the table. Elliot picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the exchange between Lyle and myself from 3 years prior. As he read Lyle's explicit response, "Just implement the code, Julian. We will sort out the legal paperwork later." I watched the color drain completely from Elliot's face. Elliot looked up at me, his hand visibly trembling as he held the paper. Lyle signed off on implementing unacquired proprietary code into our primary distribution framework. He did, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. Pinnacle enjoyed 5 years of uncompensated commercial utility from my personal copyright. My employment with this firm terminates effective 5/15 this afternoon. My intellectual property leaves with me. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of Pinnacle's corporate tower into the cool autumn evening. By Monday morning at 8 o'clock, I was standing in a sunlit corner office on the 12th floor of Nexus Logistics headquarters in downtown Chicago. My new engineering team, 6 brilliant software developers, sat around a modern mahogany conference table as I outlined our strategic rollout. Over the next 6 weeks, we deployed my fully optimized predictive distribution engine across Nexus's national network. The results were immediate and devastating to Pinnacle's market position. Within 45 days, Nexus's freight dispatch velocity increased by 38%, while our operational fuel and intermodal overhead dropped by 32%. We were delivering freight faster, cheaper, and with 99.8% predictive accuracy. 2 months into my tenure at Nexus, Vanguard Global Enterprises opened their annual supply chain contract for competitive bidding. Armed with our superior performance metrics, Grant Mercer and I presented a proposal to Vanguard's executive board that demonstrated we could outperform Pinnacle's best distribution benchmarks by an insurmountable margin. 3 weeks later, Vanguard formally terminated its 30-year relationship with Pinnacle Freight Systems, transferring 45% of Pinnacle's total annual freight volume to Nexus Logistics. The fallout at Pinnacle was instantaneous. The news of losing their flagship account sent shockwaves through the financial markets. Pinnacle's corporate stock plunged by 74% over 5 trading sessions. Financial analysts issued scathing downgrades, citing catastrophic operational vulnerability and leadership failure. On a rainy Thursday evening, as I walked toward my car in the Nexus underground parking garage, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Lyle Vance. His once impeccable designer suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened at the collar, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "Julian," Lyle called out, his voice hoarse, stepping into my path. "We need to talk immediately." "This is private corporate property, Lyle," I said, stepping back and keeping my distance. "You have no standing to be here. You have ruined this company," Lyle shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the garage. "Losing the Vanguard account has forced us into immediate restructuring. We are facing 450 workforce layoffs across 3 regional terminals under the Warren Act, Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101. 450 families are losing their livelihoods because of your corporate sabotage. I stood my ground, looking at the man who had laughed in my face over a 15% raise. I did not sabotage Pinnacle, Lyle. I simply reclaimed my personal intellectual property after you refused to value the human being who created it. You spent 16 years treating your technical staff as disposable overhead, collecting multi-million-dollar bonuses while ignoring basic legal due diligence. We can fix this, Julian. Lyle stepped closer, his hands shaking as he gestured wildly. Name your figure. Whatever Nexus is paying you, Pinnacle will match it. No, we will double it. We will grant you full executive stock options and vice president titles. I looked at him with profound pity. Do you remember what you told me in your office 16 years into my service? I asked softly. You sat in your leather chair and told me that everyone is replaceable, even me. You advised me to test my luck elsewhere. I took your professional advice. Lyle froze, his mouth opening slightly as the echo of his own arrogant words returned to haunt him. You built a business on the assumption that human dedication could be exploited indefinitely. Without consequence, I added, turning toward my car door. You are not facing a technical crisis, Lyle. You are facing the consequences of your own leadership. 4 months after Vanguard shifted its business to Nexus, Pinnacle Freight Systems formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court. The bankruptcy filing triggered a wave of executive collapse. Pinnacle's board of directors convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to terminate Lyle Vance for cause, citing gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and reckless dissipation of corporate assets. Lyle was stripped of his severance package and escorted from the building by security personnel. In a desperate attempt to mitigate corporate liability, Pinnacle's remaining management filed a federal lawsuit against me and Nexus Logistics, alleging theft of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, and tortious interference with business relations. The legal battle reached its climax in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago. Elliot Reed stood before the bench, attempting to argue that Pinnacle possessed implied equitable ownership of the predictive algorithms. However, my legal team presented the dated email archives from 3 years prior, along with my black leather notebook and original contract documentation. The presiding federal judge reviewed the evidence, text-casing as he read Lyle Vance's explicit written refusal to execute a formal copyright assignment. Under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, the court ruled, copyright ownership in independently authored works remains with the author absent a signed written assignment. Pinnacle Freight Systems implemented unacquired intellectual property at its own peril. The non-compete claims are declared void initio due to lack of consideration. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. We had won a complete legal victory. Yet, as I walked down the steps of the federal courthouse, the taste of victory felt unexpectedly bitter. The following Tuesday, I was working in my office at Nexus when my administrative assistant announced an unscheduled visitor. Standing in the doorway was Sylvia, Pinnacle's former director of customer experience. Sylvia was 56 years old, a 19-year veteran of Pinnacle who had been a steady, reassuring presence during my tenure there. We had shared hundreds of lunches in the company cafeteria, commiserating over corporate policy and sharing stories about our families. Now Sylvia stood in my office clutching her handbag with white knuckles, her face drawn and pale. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you have a few minutes, Sylvia?" "Please sit down," I said, rising from my desk and pouring her a glass of water. "It is good to see you." She did not sit, nor did she accept the glass. "I was terminated on Friday, Julian," she said, her eyes fixing on mine with painful directness, "along with my entire department, 52 people. Laid off without severance because the bankruptcy court froze our separation funds." A heavy silence descended over the room. "I am deeply sorry, Sylvia," I said quietly. "Are you?" Sylvia asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Everyone remaining at Pinnacle says you are the reason the company collapsed. They say you took the technology and burned the house down on your way out." "I did not burn anything down, Sylvia," I explained gently. "Lyle refused to pay me fair market value, mocked my tenure, and illegally exploited my personal copyright. I exercised my legal rights. I understand the legal arguments, Julian, Sylvia replied, tears welling in her eyes. But I am 56 years old. Who is going to hire a 56-year-old customer experience director in this economic climate? My husband has medical bills. Gavin from operations has 3 kids in college. Nora from accounting was 2 years away from her pension. We did not mock you, we did not steal your code. But we are the ones paying the price for your war with Lyle. Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The moral complexity of my vengeance crashed over me. In punishing Lyle Vance for his arrogance, the collateral damage had rippled through hundreds of innocent lives. Colleagues who had done nothing wrong except work for a mismanaged enterprise. Sylvia turned and walked out of my office. Leaving her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog, I sat at my desk for hours after she left, staring out at the Chicago skyline as night fell. Grant Mercer texted me celebrating our latest quarterly revenue figures. Nexus had captured 34% of Pinnacle's former market share. I did not reply. I realized then that true justice could not stop at corporate destruction. If I allowed my victory to remain a story of personal retaliation, I was no better than Lyle Vance, treating human beings as collateral damage in a corporate chess game. At 8 o'clock the following morning, I walked into Grant Mercer's executive office without an appointment. We have a moral obligation. Grant, I stated plainly, placing a binder on his desk. Grant looked up from his computer, surprised. An obligation to whom? To the displaced workforce at Pinnacle, I replied, sitting down across from him. Nexus has gained 34% market share and tens of millions in new revenue directly as a result of my transition. We are expanding our operations rapidly to handle the Vanguard account. I want to establish a formal corporate recruitment initiative called Operation Rebound. Grant leaned back, scanning the proposal. Operation Rebound? We will guarantee interviews for every qualified former Pinnacle employee displaced by the bankruptcy, I explained. For employees over 50 who face age discrimination in the job market, we will establish specialized consulting roles and transition packages. For younger staff, we will fund skills upgrading programs through local technical institutes. Grant studied me carefully, his expression shifting from corporate skepticism to deep respect. Julian, this will cost several $100,000 in onboarding and retraining funds. It is an investment in our human capital, I countered, and it is the only way I will continue leading this division. We cannot build a sustainable company on the ashes of ruined lives. Grant smiled slowly and extended his hand across the desk. Draft the press release. I will take it to the board for immediate approval. 4 weeks later, Operation Rebound was launched publicly. Nexus committed dedicated capital to absorb displaced Pinnacle workers. Over the next 3 months, our HR team interviewed hundreds of applicants. Sylvia was hired as Chief Customer Experience Officer at Nexus, overseeing an expanded department of 52 team members, including 40 former Pinnacle representatives. Gavin joined as Senior Operations Coordinator, and Nora was brought into our financial compliance group. The industry response was overwhelming. Major business publications featured Nexus's innovative approach to corporate displacement, praising our ethical leadership model. Client retention soared as corporate accounts cited our social responsibility as a key factor in selecting Nexus as their primary freight partner. 8 months after my departure from Pinnacle, I received an unexpected text message from Elliot Reed, Pinnacle's former chief legal counsel. "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" he wrote. "I have information regarding your departure that you deserve to know. We met at a quiet diner in suburban Chicago." Elliot looked noticeably aged. His hair had turned silver at the temples, and deep exhaustion lines surrounded his eyes. He had been let go during Pinnacle's liquidation proceedings. "Nexus is actively recruiting legal counsel for our contract compliance team, Elliot." I offered as we sat in a quiet booth. Elliot shook his head with a faint smile. "I appreciate that, Julian, but that is not why I asked to see you today. It is about Lyle Vance and your predictive algorithms." I tensed slightly. "The bankruptcy court settled those claims months ago." "I know," Elliot said, taking a sip of black coffee. "But while archiving Pinnacle's internal server records for the liquidation trustee, I discovered something in Lyle's deleted email archives from 3 years ago. What did you find?" Elliot leaned across the table, lowering his voice. 3 years ago, when you first emailed Lyle proposing formal licensing terms for your personal copyright, Lyle did not just dismiss you. He forwarded your technical documentation to an external intellectual property firm in New York, asking if Pinnacle could patent your algorithms under the company's name without your knowledge. I stared at him in disbelief. Lyle tried to patent my personal work behind my back? Yes. Elliot nodded gravely. The patent attorney sent him a formal legal opinion, stating that because you authored the code on personal hardware during off hours, any patent application filed by Pinnacle without your written consent would constitute fraud against the United States Patent Office. They explicitly advised him to execute a formal acquisition contract and offer you substantial equity. What did Lyle do? Elliot let out a heavy sigh. Lyle buried the legal opinion. He emailed the patent attorney telling them to close the file, and then he sent you that email telling you to just implement the code and sort out paperwork later. He knew all along that he had no legal right to your work. He intentionally gambled with the entire enterprise because he believed your blue-collar loyalty would prevent you from ever standing up for yourself. The revelation settled over me like a cold wave. My departure had not destroyed Pinnacle. Lyle's systematic deception and breach of fiduciary duty had doomed the firm years before I ever walked into his office to request a 15% raise. He had built an empire on stolen foundation stones, waiting for the structural collapse that was bound to come. "Thank you for telling me this, Elliot," I said softly. "You deserve to know that your actions were entirely justified, Julian," Elliot said firmly. "Lyle did not just undervalue you. He treated every employee, every contract, and every legal obligation as disposable. You simply exposed the rot that was already there." 2 days later, my office phone rang. The receptionist's voice sounded hesitant. "Julian, there is a man in the lobby asking to see you. He refuses to give his name, but he says it is urgent." I walked out to the lobby. Standing beside the reception desk was Lyle Vance. He looked broken. The sharp executive presence was entirely gone, replaced by a slumping posture and a weathered face. He wore a plain, unpressed suit, clutching a worn leather briefcase. "Julian," Lyle said quietly, his voice lacking any trace of its former arrogance. "Thank you for seeing me. We can speak in my office, Lyle," I said, leading him down the hall. Inside, Lyle sat down stiffly in the leather chair across from my desk, the same chair design he had once ruled from in his executive tower. "Pinnacle's final liquidation auction concludes next week," Lyle said, staring down at his hands. "The remaining assets are being sold for scrap value. The bankruptcy trustee has finalized the severance distributions. But there are still 35 operational employees who have nowhere to go." "Why are you telling me this, Lyle?" Lyle swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly. "Because I know about Operation Rebound. I know you hired Sylvia, Gavin, Nora, and 84 others. I came here today to ask, to beg, that you consider absorbing these final 35 workers into Nexus. They did nothing wrong. They trusted my leadership, and I failed them completely. I studied the man sitting across from me. The arrogance that had defined him for decades had dissolved into genuine, painful remorse. I misjudged you, Julian," Lyle added softly, looking up to meet my eyes. "I thought loyalty was something executives were entitled to extract from employees without return. I thought power meant making people feel small. I was wrong about everything. My career is over, my reputation is destroyed, and I am facing shareholder derivative lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. I deserve every bit of it. But those 35 workers do not." I looked at him for a long moment, feeling the final traces of bitterness leave my heart. "Send their resumes to Sylvia today, Lyle," I said calmly. "If they meet our operational standards, Nexus will hire every single one of them." Lyle closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "Thank you, Julian. Thank you." 1 year after I walked out of Pinnacle Freight Systems with my technical audit binder, I stood inside the grand ballroom of a downtown Chicago hotel, accepting the National Supply Chain Innovator Award. Cameras flashed across the crowded ballroom as hundreds of industry executives, logistics leaders, and software engineers applauded. Standing near the front tables were Sylvia, Gavin, Nora, Nolan, whom we had hired away from Pinnacle's liquidation team 6 months prior, and 84 former Pinnacle employees now wearing Nexus executive badges. I stepped up to the podium, looking out over the sea of familiar faces. Innovation is frequently measured in mathematical efficiency, transit velocity, and operational cost reductions, I said. Into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. But the true foundation of any sustainable enterprise is not found in lines of code or proprietary algorithms. It is found in recognizing the intrinsic value of the human beings who dedicate their lives to building your vision. I looked directly toward the table where my engineering team sat. When executives treat loyalty as a one-way obligation and human dedication as a disposable support cost, they create single point-of-failure vulnerabilities that no algorithm can fix. Corporate success belongs to those who understand that leadership is not about making people feel replaceable. It is about creating an environment where talent is valued, protected, and compensated appropriately. The room erupted into a standing ovation. After the ceremony, as I navigated through the crowd accepting congratulations, a young woman approached me holding a leather binder against her chest. She was 25 years old, her eyes bright with nervous determination. "Mr. Ross," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Chloe. I am a junior software engineer at a regional logistics firm in Indiana. I watched your keynote presentation online last month." "It is a pleasure to meet you, Chloe," I replied with a warm smile. "I wanted to ask you a question, Mr. Ross," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "I have been at my firm for 3 years. I developed an automated inventory tracking module on my personal time that reduced our terminal errors by 40%. When I asked my manager for a modest promotion last week, he laughed and told me I should be grateful to have a seat in the office. How do you know when it is time to walk away?" I looked at her binder, seeing the exact reflection of my 26-year-old self. "Do not wait 16 years to demand your true value, Chloe," I told her earnestly. "Document your personal creations meticulously. Understand your legal rights under federal law. Know your intrinsic worth, and never apologize for requiring an employer to treat you with dignity and fair compensation. Loyalty is an honorable trait, but it must always flow in both directions." Chloe smiled deeply, nodding her head. "Thank you, Mr. Ross. That is exactly what I needed to hear." As Chloe walked toward the exit, I glanced toward the back of the ballroom. Standing near the shadow of the doorway was Lyle Vance. He wore a simple dark suit, looking quiet and subdued. He did not approach the crowd or seek attention. Our eyes met across the broad room. Lyle gave me a single respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of a lesson hard learned. I returned the nod with equal respect. He had lost his executive status, his corporate empire, and his personal fortune. But in losing those material illusions, he had finally gained an understanding of human dignity. I had gained professional autonomy, financial security, and executive recognition. But more importantly, I had learned that true leadership requires taking responsibility for the lives impacted by your decisions. 2 weeks after the awards banquet, I received a small wooden box in the mail at my Nexus office. Inside was a hand-carved brass desktop plaque engraved with a quote from my award acceptance speech. "No one determines your value but you." Attached was a brief, handwritten note from Lyle Vance. "Julian, thank you for teaching me what true leadership means. The remaining 35 workers you hired are thriving at Nexus. You were never replaceable. Sincerely, Lyle." I placed the plaque on the corner of my mahogany desk, right next to the framed photograph of my late parents. Looking out through my office window at the bustling Chicago freight yards below, I watched our autonomous trucks navigating the distribution hubs seamlessly, powered by the predictive algorithms I had authored during late nights in a quiet Midwestern apartment. The algorithms were complex, multivariable mathematical constructions, but the core lesson of my career was remarkably simple. Corporate titles fade, executive power shifts, and market structures fluctuate. But your intrinsic worth as a human being is non-negotiable. When you recognize your own value and refuse to let anyone discount it, you do not just transform your own career. You build a world where loyalty is finally met with justice. If this story resonated with your professional journey, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with a colleague who might currently be sitting in a quiet cubicle, wondering if their contributions matter. Subscribe to support more stories about finding your voice in corporate spaces designed to silence you. and leave a comment below sharing your own experiences with workplace loyalty and self-worth. Because sometimes, the most powerful career decision you will ever make is refusing to be treated as replaceable.